Rain slid down the glass like quiet tears, blurring the world outside into something distant and unreachable, the kind of world he had long stopped believing in. He sat perfectly still, fingers interlocked on the table, his watch ticking louder than the storm, his jaw set like a man waiting not for someone, but for something to end. This was his final agreement. One last blind date, one last attempt at something he had already buried. If you believe every story hides a lesson, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Stories, because sometimes, the smallest moments carry the deepest truths. He wasn't always this cold. There was a time when laughter came easily to him, when the future felt like something to chase, not something to endure. But years of betrayal, loss, and the quiet erosion of trust had carved something else into him, something distant, unreadable, almost untouchable. People admired him, feared him, depended on him, but no one really knew him anymore. And he preferred it that way. The restaurant glowed warmly around him, golden lights reflecting off polished surfaces, couples leaning into each other, voices blending into a soft hum of connection. He didn't belong here, not anymore. This place was built for people who still believed in beginnings. And then the door opened. A gust of cold air slipped in first, followed by the sound of rain, and then her. She stood at the entrance, holding a dark umbrella, her dress lightly damp from the storm, her hair pulled back in a simple, effortless way that made her look like she hadn't tried too hard, and yet somehow, she stood out more than anyone else in the room. Not because she was perfect, but because she seemed real. Grounded, like she carried something unseen but deeply felt. For a moment, she didn't move. She just looked around, as if searching, uncertain, and yet not afraid. Something shifted inside him, subtle, unwelcome. She spotted him, and instead of smiling instantly, instead of performing the usual polite gestures people wore like masks, she hesitated. Just for a second, as if she could already sense the wall sitting across from her. As if she understood that this wasn't going to be easy. When she finally walked toward him, it wasn't with excitement, but with quiet courage. He noticed everything. The way she placed her umbrella carefully by the door, not wanting to disturb the space. The way her eyes briefly softened when they met his, not with admiration, but with curiosity. She wasn't impressed by him. And somehow, that unsettled him more than anything else ever had. They sat across from each other, the distance between them filled with everything he refused to say and everything she didn't rush to ask. Time passed differently then. He expected the usual questions. The rehearsed charm. The attempts to impress him or win him over. But she didn't play that game. Instead, there was silence, comfortable, breathing silence. The kind that made him aware of how long it had been since he'd felt anything other than control. Outside, the rain grew heavier, tapping insistently against the windows like a memory trying to get back in. And slowly, almost without noticing, he found himself watching her not as a distraction, but as something real. Something steady. There was no rush in her. No need to prove anything. She carried her own quiet story, and somehow, that made him want to know it. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like leaving. The evening unfolded in small, unremarkable moments, shared glances, pauses that didn't feel awkward, the faintest hint of something neither of them named. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was alive. And that frightened him, because walls are easy to build, but terrifying to dismantle. At some point, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He didn't want this to be the last. Not because she had done anything extraordinary, but because she hadn't. She hadn't tried to fix him, hadn't tried to impress him, hadn't tried to break through his defenses. She had simply been there. And somehow, that was enough. As the night came to an end, the rain softened, like the world itself was exhaling. She stood again at the door, picking up her umbrella, ready to step back into whatever life she came from. No expectations, no promises, and yet, something in him refused to let the moment close so easily. Not with grand gestures, not with desperate words, just a quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, the life he had shut himself away from hadn't disappeared. Maybe it had simply been waiting. Waiting in moments like this. Waiting in people like her. Before this story ends, take a second to comment what you're feeling right now, because sometimes, sharing a feeling is the first step to understanding it. He watched her step into the fading rain, her figure slowly disappearing into the soft blur of the night. And for the first time in years, the silence he felt wasn't empty. It was open. If this story touched your heart in any way, don't just scroll away, like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Stories, because somewhere out there, another story might be waiting to find you when you need it most.